The Leafs aren't done yet, as a new report from Elliotte Friedman has revealed that something big is brewing for the Toronto Maple Leafs, and Timothy Liljegren's name is in the center of those conversations. So break down that report, as well as discuss some new details that have emerged surrounding Nick Robertson. So stay tuned for all that in this episode. But before we do, if you're part of the percentage that aren't subscribed to the channel, about 70% of you guys aren't subscribed, make sure to hit that subscribe button. It would mean the world to Darius and myself. But Darius, we have some new information that came out today in the latest 32 Thoughts podcast surrounding Elliotte Friedman and the Toronto Maple Leafs, and some very interesting quotes came out about this. Now, he spoke about potential trades. He also gave some very interesting details surrounding Nick Robertson, but let's start with what he said about Timothy Liljegren. And if you listen to the podcast there, a lot of different things came out about Timothy Liljegren, Darius, and I'll let you explain exactly what they were, but it seems like his name, as well as Connor Timmins, are on the forefront of conversations here heading into the offseason, or heading into the regular season, sorry, as the offseason finishes up.
Yeah, so yesterday morning, we got some new information on Nick Robertson, which we'll get to in this video. And based off that, I thought there was a very interesting snippet from Elliotte Friedman in the newest 32 Thoughts podcast, where he basically said, based on everything that Brad Treliving has come out and said about Nick Robertson and training camp and how much competition there will be, and the fact that they want a bunch of forwards to try and make the team, right, out of training camp, he thinks, like, if you're Timothy Liljegren or Connor Timmins, you must be thinking, what the heck is going on? And I thought that quote was very interesting because he singled out Timothy Liljegren and Connor Timmins specifically. And we've been talking about them the last couple of days, that possibly they're the odd man out, right? We've been talking a lot about the forwards, but possibly the defensemen are the odd man out. And I mean, Connor Timmins has been a guy the last couple of years who, you know, he's signed to quite a bit of money for what he does and how little he plays with the Leafs over the last couple of years. And again, this year, he's probably going to be an eighth, maybe even ninth defenseman with the way the depth chart is shaking out so far. So he could be an option for sure, definitely for me, but he doesn't shed that much salary if you trade him. Now, if you look at Timothy Liljegren, he just signed that contract that, you know, we thought Nick Robertson was going to be a sign and trade. I thought when Timothy Liljegren signed this contract that was going to be a sign and trade. I thought that was definitely going to be the move there, but that hasn't happened. He signed for $3 million for the next 2 years, $6 million contract total. But, you know, if you trade him, you shed a lot of salary. A couple guys could probably make the roster, and you could have a couple extra forwards if you want, because, you know, guys like Ryan Reeves are not going to play every game. So I thought that was very interesting that Friedman singled out those two specifically, and probably Liljegren because of how much he makes, because, you know, his season last year wasn't that great, but you could chalk it up to maybe his injury. We'll have to see this year if he does stay with the team, if he does take a step forward because he is healthy. But I thought it was very interesting that he singled out those two.
Yeah, and obviously Connor Timmins and Liljegren are in very different spots, because Liljegren is penciled in to be probably in the opening night game against the Habs in the lineup, depending on how they love the matchup with Yanni Hakanpää, who's also signed now. But yeah, it was a very interesting quote. He basically said, if you're Timmins or you're Liljegren, you're thinking, what is going on with your future in Toronto? And that is because of a trade surrounding that, obviously surrounding them. But Max Pacioretty, in order to sign him to an NHL deal, you have to trade somebody, like we've been discussing on this channel. And it doesn't seem like, which we'll get into in a second, Nick Robertson is going to be that guy. So then you're looking at either David Kampf or, more than likely, a defenseman in the form of Timothy Liljegren and Connor Timmins, which makes the Yanni Hakanpää signing make even more sense. We know they've also been linked to Mark Giordano. So if they're going to sign guys who are more have more experience, more veterans, it makes sense to maybe move on, especially from a guy like Connor Timmins, even though I think that Liljegren's contract is a bit of an obstacle if they're going to trade him. That being said, some teams I'm sure would prefer to have him under contract for a couple of years. So it's going to be very interesting. You see this tweet here that I've had up for a little bit here. You can say it's easy to forget how effective he actually is/was, and talking about how Liljegren could be a huge upgrade to the D. 5-goal, 35-point pace last season, being a solid two-way D who hits and blocks often with decent possession numbers. Like, there is a world where Timothy Liljegren plays next season. He plays 70-odd games and is very, very good, and maybe even moves himself up. He's drawn in by some mock people or some mock lineups as the second on the second line of the blue line. Some people have him down to the third pairing, depending on what happens there. So there's a lot of different ways to go about it. Ultimately, I think that Connor Timmins is probably more likely to get traded, but won't give it much value back besides some cap relief to open up space for Max Pacioretty. I think at this point, if a Liljegren trade was going to happen, it would have happened closer to when they signed him back a couple months ago.
Yeah, and I think they have to open up salary cap space. Like you said, there's a trade coming because of, you know, Pacioretty. They got assigned to a contract. They have far too many guys right now. There's absolutely going to be a trade before opening night, right? Because they want everyone to come into training camp. That's fine. A couple guys are on PTOs, and they'll see who makes the team and where. Now, I've heard Yarncroke's name thrown around too. For me, he's a right shot. He doesn't make that much. I think you could keep him on the team. I think there's other guys here like Liljegren. Like you said, a couple of guys are making mock lineups on Twitter. We've been seeing them and dissecting them on stream. And right now, I see him as their sixth defenseman, right? And he could be replaced for Hockenpah on certain nights. So if he's your sixth defenseman, he's still a pretty good defenseman. Like he's an NHL defenseman on most teams, right? So if you want to trade him, he's a right shot defenseman, a good two-way guy. I'm sure you'd get more or you would get more value for him than a guy like, Connor Timmins, for example. And Connor Timmins wouldn't even shed that much cap. Maybe you have to attach a draft pick to that. Probably not, but something like that, right? You might be giving up another asset in a Connor Timmins trade. But it's very interesting. There's definitely going to be a trade coming because a lot of guys are going to be fighting for spots here. And I think something maybe we're not expecting is going to happen in training camp. Like a guy might make a team that make the team that we weren't really expecting. There's a guy like Alex Steves too. Nobody's really talking about. He just signed, and I'm sure he'll see some time in the NHL this year. Maybe not to start the season, but he's another wild card as well. So there's a lot going on right now, and the fact that Friedman pointed out those two guys specifically, and the fact that I think the fan base is split, especially on Liljegren right now. Like I feel like the fan base would be okay if Connor Timmins was to get traded because he hasn't really played that much. But I think the fan base is really split on Liljegren right now, and probably even Leafs management because I think they're trying to build a bigger team, especially on the back end. So I think it's going to be very interesting. He makes a lot of money. It's $3 million for what he brings to the table, and that could help the Leafs with signing somebody out of training camp.
Yeah, you're either really high or really low on Timothy Liljegren. There's not too much in between among the fan base. So let us know what your thoughts are on that. And we got a Nick Robertson update now, and it kind of even relates to this Liljegren stuff because obviously we spoke about how Nick Robertson could potentially get traded in order to make room for Max Pacioretty, who is going to be a Leaf very soon, even though he's on a PTO, be a full-time Leaf, of course. But basically, Darren Dreger has come out, and Elliotte Friedman basically echoed the same thing that Darren Dreger said. Dreger said a big part of why Nick Robertson re-signed with the Leafs was, yes, because of the new coach and a new opportunity, but quite frankly, it was also because there wasn't much trade interest in Robertson from other teams around the league this summer. So someone, whether it's Frank Saravalli or Chris Johnson, their sources over there are getting thrown for a loop because Darren Dreger came out and said the opposite. We heard a couple days ago that the Leafs are still potentially looking to trade Nick Robertson, and his value is still high. His value is still there. He's more likely to end up not a Leaf compared to a Leaf when the season starts in a month or so. Elliotte Friedman on this podcast as well said the exact same thing. He expects Nick Robertson to report to camp and start opening night for the Toronto Maple Leafs. So it seems like Nick Robertson, a trade in that front, is probably off the table. You still can never say never. I think in Elliotte Friedman's podcast, he said if there was a major offer that blows them away, then they would still look to trade him. But for now, it seems like Nick Robertson's going to stay in Toronto because of the lack of trade value for him, which is a little surprising, but also makes sense given the lack of production that he's had consistently throughout his very brief career because of Sheldon Keefe, as well as I'm assuming the value that Brad Treliving wanted to get back if you're trading a guy who is probably going to be one of your better goal scorers aside from the top guys.
Yeah, and if that trade never, got pieced together and there was no real interest there, then I don't think it's going to happen at this point either, right? Maybe he has a little bit more interest because he's signed, but I don't know about that. I'm sure other teams were confident if they traded for him that they would be able to sign him. So I don't know. I'm excited to watch this player play. And if you strip everything away, right? Because Brett Living came out the last couple of days and he had a lot of early September GM speak where he's like, really hyping up his players, and we expect all of that. And of course, he's going to do that even if he wants to trade a guy. But if you look at everything, if you strip it all away and even look between the lines, it makes no sense for them to trade this player at this point. Go into the camp, see what he has, see where he fits into your lineup. And if he doesn't, then maybe you look at a trade. But I think for the most part, he's penciled into their plans, right? We don't know exactly where, but he's penciled into the plans this season. It sounds like Berube wants to work with him. So I'm excited to see what he does this year. And I just don't think that he gets traded, especially to start the season. Maybe, you never know what happens over the course of a season. Maybe he does get dealt at some point this year. I'm not saying that's not going to happen, but to start the season, I feel like he's definitely a part of their plans and he'll be on the Leafs.
Yeah, let us know your thoughts on all these reports. A lot of stuff is going down. The Leafs and Habs are also having their prospect showdown, so make sure to keep you up to date with that. But thank you guys for watching. See you tomorrow.